to meet as well. Thank you so much. Thank you. Gosh. Yeah, good. Spontaneous applause. Spontaneous applause is wonderful. Thank you very much. Good evening. Welcome to Holyrood Sources Live. This is the battle for Bute House, recording at Johnny Walker on Princess Street in Edinburgh, with huge thanks to Diageo, who are supporting this evening, and our sponsor for this evening's episode as well, the Scotch Whisky Association's Made to be Measured campaign. Throughout the course of the evening, you will hear from the First Minister, John Swinney. You will hear from the Scottish Labour leader, Anas Sarwar. This is the first of what will be several special podcast episodes before next year's parliamentary election. Let's now do a proper welcome, shall we, to the Ant and Dec of Scottish politics, the Bute and House of insider knowledge.
He looks a bit like Ant.
The camper and van of political discourse, Geoff Aberdein and Andy Maciver. I didn't know I was going to do that. I was actually going to point out, it's just struck me that last time we were here in this venue doing a podcast special, Humza Yousaf was sitting in that seat, Andy. I think he's a big fan of the podcast, so I've heard. Right, Geoff, less than a year to go. How would you rate the contest ahead of these Scottish parliamentary elections? How would you rate it at this point?
Well, it hasn't got started yet in earnest. I think the Hamilton by-election happening when it did certainly made Scottish politics interesting for a period of time in terms of understanding where the votes might fall in less than a year's time. But I have to say that we've got two parties here tonight, and the reality is one of the people we're about to interview are going to be First Minister, unless something ridiculous happens. Let's not rule that out. But you couldn't really put a fag paper between them in terms of policy positions. Let's leave independence aside for a second. And so I'm really interested to understand if we can tease that out tonight, where there might be some policy differences. But secondly, and you can already see it happening, and for those regular listeners in the podcast, I've said this for some time, you can already tell how this is going to be framed. You're going to have Anas Sarwar saying, "Your government's rubbish, Mr. Swinney." And Mr. Swinney's going to be saying, no, your government's rubbish, Mr. Sarwar. And I'd like to see conviction, boldness and vision, and I think that's sorely lacking in our politics just now. I was privileged to work alongside Alex Salmond. I know many people may not agree with his politics, and they may not agree with him as a character, but my God, he had conviction. And when he went after something, he did it with the might of his party and indeed the government when he became First Minister. I'd like to see more of that in our politics, regardless of whether you agree with him.
Andy, I suppose a sort of similar question. As we gather here towards the end of June, 11 months to go, where are things at?
Well, Geoff mentioned fag paper there, and we're at the fag end of the fourth term of SNP government. We're going to hear from a certain well-known psephologist shortly, whose prediction or extrapolation after the Hamilton by-election was that even after the Hamilton by-election, we're going to get a fifth term of SNP government. Now, if you look really anywhere else in the democratic world, after 4 terms of a government which is mixed, whose record is mixed even by the definitions of his own people who think his record is mixed, it'd be very unusual for that government anywhere else to win again. So I think the question really for Labour and Anas Sarwar is, if you don't win, why not? If you don't win easily, why not? What is it that's going wrong? What is it about Scotland that means there is really no competition for a government which isn't even performing all that well? So I think, let's see if we get that answer tonight. Is Anas Sarwar going to provide a credible challenge to a government that's already been in power for almost 20 years? And let's see what he says.
As part of this evening, we will spend 40 minutes with John Swinney, we'll spend 40 minutes with Anas Sarwar, and then you'll have a break, an interval, 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll spend half an hour debriefing. Ahead of that, we want to give you a little glimpse at the sort of expertise you will get in that debrief. Please welcome Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University.
It's like being in the middle of the three wise men here, isn't it? I'm not quite sure where the slings and arrows of misfortune are going to come from. There we go.
Well, John, it's so good to see you. Thank you for being here. I suppose, from what Geoff and Andy have said, there's this kind of perception of maybe a slightly stagnant contest. Is it exciting? What is your assessment of where things are at for these two men specifically, John Swinney and Anas Sarwar, with less than a year to go?
The answer is that neither of them are in the place where they would like to be. The SNP have not significantly recovered from the reverses that they suffered, beginning with the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon. They're a little bit better in the polls than the 30% that they got in the UK general election last year, but not much. However, in the meantime, we've had nearly a year of a UK Labour government, a UK Labour government that has lost support more quickly and more deeply than any previously newly elected government in British suffragological history. And the Scottish Labour Party, whose essential appeal last year was, well, we know you don't like the SNP, so you need to vote for us to send a message to them. And we know you hate the Tories, so you need to vote for us in order to ensure that that happens. But the trouble is that they are now in government. And the truth is, one of the key messages of the 2024 election was that being in government sucks. So the Conservatives lost ground very heavily across the UK. The SNP lost ground heavily north of the border. And the Labour Party in Wales also lost ground in Wales. In other words, and this was part of a broader pattern of elections across the world in 2024. But the point is that, therefore, as a result of that, Labour find themselves in terms of the polls, and I'll say straight away, Hamilton does not in any way negate what the polls are saying. Labour are basically back down to around the fifth of the vote that they got in 2021 when they came third across Scotland. And essentially, the whole of the Scottish revival for Labour that began actually with Partygate, continued with Liz Truss, much like the case south of the border, and only latterly was to do with the difficulties of the SNP. All of that has gone. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we're simply going to get more of the same at Holyrood, because, of course, the new kid on the block, Reform, although nothing like as popular as they are south of the border. I mean, across the UK as a whole now, we're getting so-called MRP polls that say Reform would get an overall majority if they were elected. Although they're only winning about 30% of the vote, but because they're ahead of everybody else, that is not inconceivable. Now, they're not as strong north of the border because essentially Reform's vote is very, very heavily embedded in those who voted Leave, and there are a few of those in Scotland, but they're running at about 20% in the polls in Scotland. That does mean they will have if they can run at that kind of level on the regional list vote, they will have a significant presence in the Holyrood chamber. And it may, there are various possibilities at this point, and this is why the election is still a knife edge. It's still possible, because of the way in which the electoral system operates, and because the SNP, although they're only at 33%, currently, however, something like 14, 15 points of everybody else, could get so much in terms of the constituency seats that we might still just get a pro-independence majority at Holyrood, and that matters, by the way, for the future of politics. But equally, it's also perfectly possible that we will get an SNP government that looks much closer to the one of 2007 to 2011 in terms of its position in the Parliament. But, of course, the crucial difference between now and then is that there is no prospect of Russell Findlay being the person who keeps the SNP minority government going, which is what Annabel Goldie did between 2007 and 2011. So I think, therefore, managing that Parliament could be... So you talked earlier on about, the SNP will still be in power. Well, they might still be in office. I think what's still at stake in this election is whether the SNP will still be in power.
John Curtice, for now, thank you very much. We'll catch up again later on. There you go. That's the context. Let's get to it, shall we? And let's welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast the First Minister of Scotland, the SNP leader, John Swinney. Hiya, thanks very much. John, good to see you. Thanks for coming Good to see you, First Minister. Thank you for being here.
Grand.
Busy day in
Obviously.
Parliament, so
It's been a
thank
busy
you.
day, Parliament and lots of other places as well. So.
Fair enough.
As they all are.
As they all are. As they all are. It's good to see you. Thank you for being here. Now, I think before we kind of get into Scottish domestic issues in that way, I think it would be remiss of us not to reflect the sort of geopolitical pressures that we are all witnessing unfolding, particularly, of course, in the Middle East at the moment. And I suppose the crucial question that has emerged in the last few days is where Scotland stands, where the UK stands, when it comes to US action against Iran. Does this Scottish Government support the action the US took at the weekend?
Well, I argued that the priority at the weekend was for de-escalation, because I don't think it supports any of our interests for the situation to escalate any further beyond the already incredibly dangerous level that it has reached. So we're obviously in a situation now, compared to Sunday morning, which is significantly more reassuring than it was then. But there is still a long way to go to create the type of stability that could give any of us confidence. And I think the dangers that are there are so acute for all of us in the immediate context of what is going on in the Middle East. But then the implications of that could flow into some of the wider challenges that we wrestle with domestically about economic issues or about societal and cohesion issues within our communities, which will be with us really very quickly if the situation does not stabilise.
I suppose the criticism of that view of calling for de-escalation has been that it makes the UK seem as though it's a bystander in all of this, that we're not a part of trying to prevent Iran become a nuclear power. We're not a part of trying to limit this tyrannical regime that oppresses people in Iran every single day. Is being a bystander a bad thing?
It's not. I don't think it's. I certainly wouldn't want the UK to be a bystander. I was arguing for the UK to use its international credibility and its engagement with other countries to advance the case for de-escalation and to, one of my huge anxieties about the current context is I've grown up in a society, I believe fundamentally in a rules-based system of international engagement. It's been the hallmark of the post-World War II environment. I think that's served us incredibly well. I see that getting increasingly fractured by every passing week that there is. So the more that the UK can use its influence to argue for a rules-based system and a rules-based system of engagement, which involves making sure through negotiation that Iran does not. I don't want countries to have nuclear weapons. I think it's fundamentally dangerous. How can we look at this situation and say this is helping to create stability? So a rules-based system can make significant achievements, but I worry that rules-based system is now under enormous threat as a consequence.
Is there an argument then, depending on what the intelligence said about Iran's level of enrichment at that point, is there an argument potentially in favour of what Israel and the US have done in the last week?
Well, I think the intelligence, from what I can deduce from what is being communicated more widely, doesn't support that proposition, because while there is nuclear-based activity underway in Iran, there is a very vigorous debate and a contested view about whether or not that amounts to providing the capability to create a nuclear weapon. But fundamentally, we have to operate that rules-based system to avoid that situation happening. That would be a bad situation to develop. So therefore, using the power of the international community, which has on many occasions worked formidably to de-escalate situations, should be the priority in that context.
And just a final reflection, I think, on this, because it has stirred emotion, anger, frustration across the UK, even in the last few days. The former First Minister, SNP MSP Humza Yousaf, posted on X, "If the UK government believes those protesting against the atrocities in Gaza are terrorists, but those killing children should be supported and provided with weapons, then this government has not only lost its way, it has lost its conscience." He had quote-tweeted with that post, Amnesty UK's post, which shared a BBC News article headlined, "Palestine Action to be Banned After RAF Break-In." Since that post, the Home Secretary has announced that she has decided to prescribe Palestine action under Section 3 of the Terrorism Act. If approved by Parliament, it will be illegal to be a member of, or indeed to invite or demonstrate support for Palestine action. Is it fair to say that you are facing a situation now where one of your MPs is backing what is likely and about to become a prescribed terror organisation?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. I think what Hamza's reflecting on there is the fact that there are enormously significant anxieties about what is going on in Gaza. How could there not be? We all look at our television screens. It's unbearable to watch what's going on in Gaza and the degree of human suffering and the blocking of humanitarian aid going into Gaza to support people who are suffering unimaginably in Gaza. And I think the point Hamza is making is that there is a legitimate point of debate and a legitimate argument to be made about the position of the Palestinian people.
He's also implying that particular group should not be prescribed, I think it's fair to say.
Well, the Home Secretary's made her decision about that point. My feeling is there has to be freedom of speech on the issue of Palestine.
Including breaking into RAF bases?
Well, I don't agree with that. No, I don't agree with that. But
are they the actions of a terrorist organisation?
Well, but my point is this, Calum. I believe in the right of people to express their point of view, to protest. I don't agree with that it's a good idea to break into military bases. No, I don't agree with that. But I do believe people must be able and free to express their point of view about the conflict in Palestine and the suffering of people in Palestine, just as I believe people must be free to express their point of view on a whole host of other questions, including the attack on Israel by Hamas.
Sure. And so should they be prescribed, and then we'll move on?
Well, it's an issue for the Home Secretary. In my view, there has to be freedom of speech.
But we know where the UK government stands on this.
Yeah, I'm simply telling you, I think there should be freedom of speech.
OK, I'm not sure that's an answer to my question, but we shall move on. We want to talk about defence industry here at home as well. Geoff, I'm going to throw it to you on that.
Oh, yeah, I'm just very interested in the recent story concerning Rolls-Royce and the Defence Secretary, John Healey, kind of accusing the Scottish Government of student politics because they couldn't unlock £2.5 million of Scottish enterprise funding to support it. It's a well-publicised story because it went for conventional defence munitions. Genuinely, just a clarity point of mine. Well, what is the position of the Scottish Government in this? Marie Goujon, your cabinet colleague, said that they had a principled and long-standing opposition to supporting conventional defence munitions. If that's the case, is it the case? And also, is it something you might revisit, given, albeit all sad circumstances and tragic circumstances, but there is a significant economic opportunity in that?
We've had a long-standing position, so Marie Goujon is absolutely correct on this, goes back many years, whereby we don't use economic development resources in the Scottish Government to support the production of munitions. But we do use economic development resources of the Scottish Government to support the defence industry in developing their skills and their infrastructure to enable them to undertake their activity. It's the direct connection to munitions that is the point in the policy. So, for example, on other occasions, we've provided assistance to defence companies. Resources have been allocated to BE, for example, to support the development of their shipbuilding academy because it's developing the skills that are necessary to support the company and the organisation. So it's the distinction between munitions activity and the development of the capacity and the capability of organisations that support economic development within Scotland. So that's the distinction that is made. Now, you raise an issue, Geoff, about can that position be revisited? Well, of course issues can be reconsidered, and we have to be mindful, and I am conscious at this point that we are living in a very different context today, and the situation, I talked in my sort of first exchanges with Calum there about the stability that's been delivered by the rules-based system. Well, that kind of got shattered by the invasion of Ukraine, and the implications of that have been felt very acutely and very directly. And of course, in the context of the NATO summit, that increases the requirement of NATO members to be assured of their security. And I come at this from the point of view, which I've made very clear in Parliament and on other occasions that I do think the Russian threat is a very real threat that we have to respond to. So we have to, we have to consider these questions.
So potentially, in the future, you may revisit. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, really. So just on a point of clarity then, do we want one of these 6 Rolls-Royce munitions factories in Scotland?
Well, that's, if Rolls-Royce want to site it here, that's entirely up to Rolls-Royce to do so.
And you'd be open to that?
I've no objections to that. It's entirely up to them to make their decisions.
Let's turn to some political nerdery, shall we? We're going to look at the Hamilton...
Excellent.
Yes, this is what we're all here for, isn't it? We're going to turn to the Hamilton by-election and consider what that means about... We want to look forward. Of course, we're looking forward to the 2026 parliamentary election. That's what we're here for. That's what this special's about. That's what a series of specials will be about. But I think as part of that, it's worth considering for you, Mr. Swinney, this evening, with the Hamilton by-election, where you think it went wrong for the SNP.
Well, I think if you look at the... and I didn't hear what John Curtice said to you. I don't know if he's been talking about this, but I've heard John talking about the Hamilton by-election result, which essentially, if I'm paraphrasing his assessment correctly, the current opinion polls played out in the Hamilton by-election.
He's giving you a thumbs up, Mr. Swinney. Well done.
So in that sense, what that says to me is that, well, the current opinion polls played out, so where we are just now in the opinion polls, which in my view is not strong enough for us to do as well as I want us to do in the 2026 election. Thankfully, we're not in 2026 yet. We're only still in mid-2025, so there is time yet. So the opinion polls played out. Our campaign was not able to sufficiently give us an advantage against the current run of the opinion polls. So what we've got to take from that is the importance of recognising we've got to do more to do better in 2026, which is what my strategy is all about.
Mm-hmm. Fully understand the right to be given a fair hearing, which I think you've talked about before in terms of you coming to office, and then you'll make the case. Time is running out. But I just want to focus in on this campaign. I thought you had a very strong campaign message, and that was around the winter fuel payment, because the UK government hadn't met their obligations in terms of U-turning as they have now done. And as we both know, John, by-elections are sometimes won and often won on single-issue campaigns. You had the bones, you had them there where you wanted them, in my opinion, and then you chose to pivot to this reforms the bogeyman. And I think it was far too much stick and not enough carrot. And you didn't give enough people the reason to vote for you and just against something.
Well, I think that I think there's a lot of merit in that, Geoff, to be honest, and it is a mixture of. I know exactly. See, it wasn't.
Let's stop the podcast.
Well, did you hear him properly?
maybe I missed a bit there, but I'm in my generous mode tonight.
Very good of
Geoff. But the point, there is a mixture of carrot and stick, and in a sense, the point I was making about my strategy, and you've correctly summed it up, Geoff. I've had to work very hard this year to get us a hearing, because we weren't getting a hearing 12 months ago, nothing like it, as we saw in the election in the summer of 2024. So I've had to make sure we could get a hearing, and I think we're now getting a hearing. But what I also had to do is make a judgment about where I thought was a really dangerous threat to just the kind of nature of the debate in Scotland today, where I thought reform were rising spectacularly fast, and I had to do something to stop that.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring in a question
That's
from...
the judgments you've got to make in these campaigns.
Sorry to interrupt. Let's bring in a question from Ruth, who I hope is with us. Yeah, Ruth is here. Let's get a microphone over to Ruth. And by the way, when you're submitting your questions, lots of you choose, I think, to add compliments about the podcast. Ruth...
Oh.
Ruth said...
Right? Did people do that?
Yeah, I know. You've led the charge on the compliments tonight, to be fair.
Well, that was to Geoff. That was...
Well, as a regular listener, I'm sure you'll agree with Ruth, who says, I love the podcast. I missed the 25 years of devolution event, which was just over a year ago, March last year. So Ruth's been really looking forward to this. Ruth, thank you for being here. What is your question for the First Minister?
Under what circumstances would you consider an SNP-Labour coalition or confidence and supply agreement beyond 2026?
It's a sizzler, First Minister. Over to you.
This is your specialist subject, is it not?
I'm coming in just a minute. Don't worry.
You're what I think could commonly be described as obsessed by this question.
I mean, I think I'll say
maybe that's a bit extreme.
I think it's a bit strong, but
It's
it's very good to know you're a listener. That's heartening.
Well, I've got to keep in with the people in the know. You see, I do think that's quite important.
And you're still a listener.
Exactly. I suppose, Ruth, my answer is basically to say that all of this talk is for scenarios thrown up after the election. I want to do.
So not ruling it out, First Minister.
I want to. Can I possibly?
Yes.
Well, that was a dive into the deep end, even more acute than you normally go, Geoff. I want to do spectacularly well in the 2026 election. That's what my sights are on, because I want to deliver a significant advance in my political arguments for independence in the 2026 election. That requires me to do spectacularly well. So that's what I'm focused on. Whatever else they like to throw up, well, we'll deal with that when they throw it up. But one thing, just so that I can put out my sort of complete matrix of things there that are going to be off limits. I'm not going to engage around about Farage and reform. I won't engage there. Just not for me. Absolutely no way. We'll have nothing to do with it.
But that's the only party you're ruling out. Go on, Andy.
Well, since you've set me up, First Minister. So if you go back 20 years in Germany, the CDU and the SPD would have told you till they were blue in the face that they would do nothing together at all. And then the East German communists came along and they had to. I think they call it the firewall. There's a German word for it, but I got a 2 in standard grade French, so I'm not going to go for that. If you go back 10 years in Ireland, less than 10 years actually, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, mortal enemies, opposite sides of the Irish Civil War, they would have said, absolutely, we're going to do nothing together at all. And then Sinn Féin came along, and they had no choice. Now, Sir John's seat extrapolation, based on uniform swing from Hamilton, had, I think, reform, I'm sure John will correct me when I was wrong, I think it had reform on 32, Tories on 16, I think, or so. So that's 50 seats, which presumably for you are pretty much out of the equation. If you added together your, I think, 48, Greens and the Lib Dems, it's not enough. The only way to form any kind of two-party arrangement, whether it's a coalition or something less formal, would be you and Labour. So I suppose if I can turn it on its head, there must be circumstances in which you simply can't rule out the potential of you working with the person who's going to be sitting in that chair in a few minutes' time and ask Sarwar.
Well, you see, the thing is that what that forgets is 2007 to 2011,
I know.
which was the SNP on 47 seats running a minority government, in my view, very successfully in the Scottish Parliament. Now,
With Russell Finlay.
Pardon?
Not in those
That
days.
the equivalent would be with Russell Finlay, though,
What do you mean?
because you worked with Annabel Goldie the last time.
Well, I had all sorts of folk voting for my lovely budgets. One year, I made a graceful intervention at the very end of the budget statement, in budget debate, stage 3, where I invited the Labour Party to support my budget based on accepting their amendment, and they proceeded to vote against their own proposition. And then a year later, when the budget collapsed, and the Labour Party said to me, we're never voting for this terrible budget you put forward, a week later, they voted for the self-same terrible budget that I put forward a week before. So what it needs is, what I don't want you getting carried away with, Andy.
I wouldn't.
I can see I've got to get to complete sentences before I stop talking, before my position gets defined. I'm not hoping for a 2007 to 2011 scenario. I'm not sitting here saying to you, where the opinion polls just now are is just fine for me. It's not. It's not acceptable for me. I need to get us into a stronger position. But I didn't. You're extrapolating from the Hamilton by-election entirely fairly based on the numbers. I don't dispute the analysis. But I wasn't ready for an election in June of 2025. I wasn't planning for that. It came about because of tragedy, because I lost my dear colleague Christina McKelvey. I'm planning for May 2026 to be in a position to deliver what I just said to Ruth is an emphatic result that will help me propel our campaign for independence.
This is far too jovial for my liking. I have to say.
Well, I'm never often accused of that in politics, but since we're in that mode,
I recognise a lot of what you say in terms of planning for 2026, but I want to return to this. The tone and the style of the politics, John. I've complimented you before on this steadying of the ship, and I think John Curtice kind of bears that out in some of his analysis. It has been some of that. But to reclaim that massive ground that we've lost, in my opinion, there is a lack of conviction. And I want to give you one example of many, but this is one I want to talk about because I believe you've come to the right decision. I don't think you're making a virtue of it. The Climate Change Committee, Scotland's carbon budget, the latest publication, came in last month. One of the recommendations was a 26% in cattle and sheep numbers by 2035.
26% decrease.
A decrease in cattle and sheep numbers. A quarter of our livestock by 2035, in 10 years' time.
Mm-hmm.
I declare an interest. I have 2 cousins that are farmers in Buchan area and Aberdeenshire. That would decimate Scotland's agriculture sector. And an economy, a contribution to the economy of 2.9 billion a year, and massive food and drink exports as well. My understanding is, because my cousin was at the Royal Highland Show when your ministerial team indicated that was not the case, that the SNP would not do that in government. I think that's the right decision. Why have I not heard about it, John? And what I'm trying to get at here is you have made a very strong decision there, and you can get to Plinth, get to a lectern and say, do you know what, this carbon budget's got a lot of things I like about it, but we're doing a hell of a lot decarbonising our industry, but I will not go as far as to put one of our greatest sectors at risk and the livelihoods that would cost. And in turn, talking about reform, you're playing on the territory that they're taking away from you and Labour. And I'm trying to say, why are you not making more of a conviction politician about this? Why are you kind of going easy-ozy, round the sides, don't you worry, everything's going to make a bloody virtue of it?
see what getting advice from Geoff Aberdein is like. Welcome into what it's all right. Okay, so there's a couple of things I'll say about that. First is on your point about steadying the ship. One of my correspondents wrote to me the other day and said, you've steadied the ship, but the sails have not yet caught the wind. Now, I think that's a reasonably fair assessment. I think we are in a much better place. I think we're in a phenomenally better place. My party faced an existential threat a year ago, and I've rescued it from that. And you'll know how much that matters to me for how I feel about my beloved party. So that's really precious. But we've got to get moving. We've got to get growing and expanding. Now, we then come on to the carbon budget. So what have I done there? Well, I've taken what I think is the absolutely right decision for Scotland. So I've said, we're committed to the journey to net zero, so I accept the headline budget kind of reductions in carbon that we've got to do to get there. But I'm not going to take a decision that's going to decimate the rural economy of Scotland. I will not do it. So hear me out. So we took that decision. My Rural Affairs Secretary, Mary Gujong, communicated it to at the Royal Highland Show on, it was communicated in an answer to Parliament on Thursday morning, and Mary communicated it at the QMS event on Thursday morning at the Royal Highland Show. And when I went to the Royal Highland Show on Thursday, I was met with a huge amount of goodwill, encouragement and appreciation for the fact that we had taken a tricky decision, but in my view, the right decision for Scottish agriculture. Now, the fact that you've not heard that, Geoff, that tells me something that we've got to get more vigorous in our communications. So, and actually, in our politics today, I suppose I think I think it's an even greater challenge to get messages across in the current context, because the consumption of information and news and the communication of that is in such a more fragmented position than it ever has been at any other time in my political life. So I'll take your advice to heart, and I'll shout it more vigorously than But your point of substance is, I think, the most important point, because, okay, you've not heard it this week, Geoff, but in terms of how we proceed in taking forward policy which is properly framed to meet the needs of all parts of Scotland, that's got to be a vital part of what I communicate and
Just
set out.
one very brief,
Quickly,
thank you. I know Andy's going to come in, but, you know, time's a wasting. And, you know, as a former advisor, forget the party I advised, I want to see a bit of oomph. This guy gets it. He's listening to my concerns and he's acting. And I'm just not feeling that right now.
Well, okay. So, on the substance, you agree with what I've done. The issue is about how do we get that across in a context where, you know, I think it's much more challenging in the fragmented environment we're in just now to get those messages across. But did your Buchan farmers know about it?
That's how I learned about it.
Well, there you are. So
But there's a lot of Buchan farmers and a lot of farmers around the country. But more importantly, there's a lot of reform voters out there now, John, who are going around saying net zero nonsense. You need to meet them head on with substance.
That's a slightly different question to the Buchan farmers.
Sorry, I'll shut up now.
But the Buchan farmers heard about it, and then when I got to the All Highland show, I was getting, you know, and Mary Goujon tells me, and Jim Fairley, my agriculture minister, who is, you know, knows his way around the world of farming, and all the kind of farming contacts that I know heard that loud and clear because they understand they've got a government that's on their side.
Is it just briefly on that then? Because you've been very honest with us, and I mean, is it just about the consumption of news, or is it about what the news is as well? I mean, do you think, with hindsight, if you look at your programme for government, which came before the Hamilton by-election, was it a bit safe? Was it a bit safe? I mean, could you look back and say, you know, we looked like we were quite far in the lead. Maybe I was holding back a little bit. Maybe I wasn't quite radical enough. Given that we're 15 points down in the polls, given that we know we've still got, there's no wind in the sails yet, was the programme for government a little bit safe?
No, the programme for government has got to do, you know, a really fundamental thing for us, which is it's got to give us the route to delivering for people in the country, delivering the improvement in their lives that they want to feel and experience before the election. And there's a limited time window, and I've got to make sure government is absolutely focused on making that impact on the things that matter, about eradicating child poverty, on strengthening the National Health Service, on improving the economy, making the progress to net zero. So what I've done is, you know, and I make no apology for it, I've narrowed the policy focus of the government so that we can make a bigger impact on people's lives, on the things that really matter to folk. And it's those themes.
We've got about 10 minutes left. We've got a couple more questions to take from our wonderful audience here as well. We will get to those in just a second. If I could ask, though, how much do you miss Fergus Ewing?
Well, I am very, very sad about Fergus's decision, and I think it's unnecessary. Fergus was approved to stand for Parliament for the Scottish National Party. I'm pretty certain if he'd gone forward for nomination in Inverness and Nairn, every other sitting member of Parliament, the Scottish National Party has been reselected. So I can't imagine if Fergus would have been any different. So Fergus has been a friend of mine for over 40 years. Like, I'm very, very sad about it.
Would you say you're still friends?
Well, Fergus and I talk to each other, but we don't spend as much time with each other as we used to. So I'm very sad about it. Very, very sad about it.
Are you working to bring him back to the SNP?
Well, I think that to carry on the shipping metaphors, I think that ship's sailed.
Yeah, I was going to say the particular single carriageway bit of road has perhaps been burned on that particular bridge.
Well, but you see, the thing about that, Calum, is that, you know, I'm a realist about what can be delivered and what can be achieved. And, you know, what the Scottish Government has done has, over our time in office, has undertaken a huge transformation in the infrastructure of Scotland. The Queensferry Crossing, the Aberdein Western Peripheral Route, the electrification of various railways all over the country, the expansion, the development of the Borders Railway. Now, you know, we've done all of that, and it was always crystal clear. We could only commence the dualling of, well, we actually did work on the A9, we did Kincraig to Dalradi, we did Crewban Moor, we did Ballinluig, we did all these projects while we were also doing the Queensferry Crossing. And once the Queensferry Crossing was done, we started on Lunkerty to Pass-a-Burnham, and once that was done, we started on Moy into Tomatin. And we can only spend the money we've got. We can't magic out of thin air. And we've progressed on these projects as quickly as the resources have been available to do it. Now, if I had not taken a decision, which was, of course, you know, contested by all sorts of folk about the Queensferry Crossing, if I hadn't done the Queensferry Crossing, the hit on the GDP of Scotland would have been horrendous. The country would have ground to a halt.
Has anyone measured what the hit on the GDP of Scotland is by not turning the A9 and the A96 entirely into dual carriageway?
Well, of course, that economic analysis will have been done, but my point...
What's the hit?
Well,
why are we sitting here on potential GDP growth and not making it happen?
Well, because things have got to be paid for, Calum.
Yeah.
And we spent £1 billion on the Queensferry Crossing, which had to be paid for, without which there would have been a significant negative hit on Scottish GDP. So
all I'm hearing is people in the Highlands still don't have a dual carriageway to join them to the Central Belt, though.
Well, that's right. And what we're doing just now, if you know, Moy to Tomatin is underway as we speak, and the various other, every other stage, with the exception of Pass-a-Burnham to Tay Crossing, has all the road orders in place and all the designs in place to enable it to be the case.
Just on Fergus Ewing, sorry, Andy, I was just going to just bring up a comment from Fergus Ewing on independence, because we need to mention independence. You've been talking about it quite a lot, actually, in the last couple of weeks, I think that's fair to say. Fergus Ewing says independence should be put on the back burner for the next 10 years to allow the SNP to begin building trust with voters. Is he right?
No, because I've spent the last year building trust with voters, and I think I've made quite a bit of headway with that. I intend to carry on doing that, which is what the programme for government is all about delivering on people's expectations and building their confidence in the SNP as a government that can deliver for them.
Just to follow up on that particular aspect, what I do agree with Fergus Ewing is he contextualised that by saying you need a competent government, and he didn't view the current SNP administration was competent. We can have that debate. You and I had that debate earlier in the year, John, but in the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, it does suggest that on the key metrics that the Scottish Government's responsible for, there is negative approval ratings on that. Now, I know that you're trying to arrest that, but do you at least accept the case until there is, again, positive approval ratings across health, education, justice? You can't advance the case for independence.
No, because I think what's affecting many aspects of society just now is the absence of hope in people's lives, because I think folk are really struggling just now, and I think people need to have the prospect of a hopeful future ahead of them. I think that comes from independence, because I think on questions like energy, for example, a more independent stance for Scotland would be a more hopeful stance for people in Scotland. About economic opportunity, which would come from being a member of the European Union and be able to exercise independent responsibility to open up the opportunities for us. Everyone's poor just now because of Brexit. That absolutely.
So this will be a central plank of your re-election or the election campaign in 2026.
Absolutely.
When will we find out a little bit more about this strategy?
Well, if I don't. I'm not sure if I should say.
Shall I say,
go on,
SNP conference in October? We'll have a strategy.
If I'd say, I don't know if you are a member of the Scottish National Party.
I'm not.
But if you
no political party.
Well, if you were a member of the Scottish National Party,
did you not know?
Well, if you were a member of the Scottish National Party, you could have come along to a very well attended party national council at the weekend, and you would have heard unvarnished the approach to strategy of the party leader.
So there is a strategy?
Of course there is.
What is it?
Well, I'm not sitting here telling you. It's for me to work it out with my colleagues and surprise you with it.
It's a
I see his point, though. If you're going to bring the people with you and you're going to vote for that proposition,
I'll tell you what the absolutely first prerequisite is, Geoff, before we get into near all the stuff that I know that you'll be wanting to dot the I's and cross the T's of. I have to build public confidence in the concept of independence, and to see independence as the way to bring hope back into our country, because The problem we've got just now is that hope is in very, very short supply. I heard that loud and clear from folk in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, big style. And I'm trying to take very practical measures to improve the quality of life of people in Scotland. But strategically, there has to be a big, bold message about bringing hope back into this country, and that's from independence, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on setting out. And the issue for me is, and I know what you want to ask me about, and all that, what's going to be your route and all the rest of it. Big question for me is, why has my country been denied the right to choose our future? That is totally unacceptable, and it shouldn't be a question for me about how do I get a referendum. The question should be, why is Keir Starmer blocking one? That's the bigger question.
We will put that to Anna Sarwar in about 5 minutes or so. Just a very final one on independence, actually. If you were to get a referendum, a second independence referendum, say, for example, hypothetically, the people in Scotland voted no, they wanted to remain part of the UK, when would the next referendum be?
Well, let's just concentrate our minds on the fundamental issue about this country has a right to choose her constitutional future, and that is, for me, the absolutely critical, urgent priority. So let's get this one and get it done.
OK, we've got a few minutes left, a couple of questions from the audience. I want to take one from Beth Fraser, who's on the front row here. Thank you for a lovely compliment. Again, so spontaneous, these compliments.
Is it only, do you only get to ask a question if you give a compliment?
No, you don't only get to ask a question if you give a compliment, but it does boost your chances of having your question chosen. Beth says, thanks for arranging and hosting tonight's event.
This is a bit like the Secretary-General of NATO having his text messages published by Donald Trump.
By Daddy Trump.
Feels a bit like that.
Daddy Trump is what we're supposed to call him now, isn't it? Anyway, Beth said, I absolutely won most imaginative Father's Day present with tickets to a Holyrood Sources podcast special.
Oh, no.
So hello to Beth and your dad this evening. Welcome. Beth, go for it. What's your question?
In 2023, Nicola Sturgeon said, people who've opposed this bill, just as they are transphobic, you will also find that they are deeply misogynist, they're often homophobic, racist as well. Nicola Sturgeon had a very clear opinion of the opponents of the Gender Recognition Act, be they faith groups or gender critical feminists. Do you agree with her assessment, and why, or what is your own view?
Well, I think there has been and there remains an incredibly fractious debate around the issues around gender recognition, and I think what I'm trying to do is to take an approach which encourages and nurtures respectful debate within Scotland, and that's what I'm trying to bring to my leadership of the country, because I think at this particular moment the country needs that more than anything else.
So Beth's question was whether you agree with Nicola Sturgeon's assessment.
But I'm answering Beth's question to the best of my ability, that I think what I can do is try to create respectful debate in Scotland and nurture that and foster that. That's what I'm going to do.
So my interpretation of that is Nicola Sturgeon is wrong, and she was doing the opposite of what you're trying to do.
You are free, obviously, in this freedom of speech environment to come to whatever conclusions you wish, Calum.
Okay. On this podcast earlier this year, Anas Sarwar said, all things being equal, if he knew then what he knows now, he wouldn't have backed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. If you knew then what you know now, would you have backed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill?
Yes, I would have, because I was trying to improve the lives of a very small number of people in our society who I think have an incredibly hard time. But in so doing, I would not in any way, shape or form wish to jeopardise the safety and the protection of women and girls in our society.
Okay. There's lots more that we will talk about in the next 11 months on that particular issue, I'm sure. Now, we think Tom isn't here. Is Tom here who wants to ask a question on education?
He's at the back.
Oh, Tom is sitting in the window. Let us get a microphone.
We didn't even get my seat.
This is... Sorry, Tom. We'll get you a drink or something later on. Tom has a question on education. Go for it, Tom.
Thanks very much. On Tuesday last week, 49 pages of guidance to support better behaviour in Scottish schools was published by the Scottish Government. It was published in the penultimate week of term in most areas, and the ink was necessarily already dry on finalised school improvement plans across the country for the year ahead. What school leaders were expected to do with the guidance in the 10 or so days left of term was unclear. On the same day, 62 other government documents and guidance was published. The government's undeniably excellent at writing about things to be done. How will we see, in Scottish schools in particular, progress on things actually getting done?
Because of a combination of the resources that have been invested in Scottish education. So, for example, in the government's budget for this current financial year, there has been a real terms increase in the budget for local authorities, enabling greater investment in schools. There has been specific additional investment in additional support needs provision, which we recognise to be a significant challenge within schools. There has been an agreement reached with local government about increasing teacher numbers to expand the number of teachers from the current position to the levels that were the case in 2023. And in addition to that, there is, of course, in many parts of the country, the sustained investment around closing the attainment gap, which is resulting in significant progress within Scottish education, improving opportunities for young people and resulting in a very high proportion, certainly amongst record numbers, of children leaving school and going on to positive outcomes. So these are some of the measures that have been taken to implement that. I think when I was questioned about this guidance last Thursday, and I was questioned about the necessity, I suppose, was what Russell Finlay was saying to me last Thursday, to increase the number of exclusions from Scottish schools. I can't think of a worse thing to want to do, because that will deliver worse outcomes for young people. And that's what he thought was missing from the guidance that the government set out last week. Guidance, I might add, that was co-produced between the government, local authorities and teaching trade unions. So the profession was very much involved in the formulation of that guidance, because what we have to try and do is make sure that we have in place policy approaches that will support teachers in the difficult and challenging tasks that they've got to undertake, and to make sure they've got the resources and the capacity to take it all forward.
You talked about progress, academic progress as well. I've got a massive concern about, if you thought that the Grand Coalition was my pet thing, then, schools. I've got 4 kids in state schools, 2 in primary, 2 in secondary. And so I see this every day. And it's difficult to hear, I think, you talk about standards without looking at what's happening with PISA, which is the only international study we're still in. You were Education Secretary, you were in about that. If you look at PISA results in the last 20 years, which measures science, reading and maths, we were top of the UK in all 3 in 2025.
2005.
2005. The last PISA study that was done, which was 2022, we were lower than the UK average in everything. We had fallen constantly in all 3, not so badly in reading, but in science and maths, a constant fall in numbers, and we're now below the OECD average, whereas England is quite significantly above the OECD average. So that is as close as it comes to factual evidence that not only is the Scottish education system not the envy of the world, as some might say it was, not only is it not getting better in terms of academic outcomes, it's getting worse. And we also, that's factual evidence, but there's also, I think, really worrying anecdotal evidence, and you'll have spoken to lots of universities, like I have as well, of universities who are now saying that they are having to give their first-year university students who are from Scottish schools what, in effect, is remedial lessons to get them up to the level that other. Well, that's what universities have said.
No, I don't think that's any way, shape, or form a fair representation.
Are the PISA numbers a fair representation?
Well, the PISA numbers are one part of the evidence base. So yes, I'm not going to sit here and dispute that. But there are other bits of the evidence base that you have to take into account, such as, and we have this now, and of course it's very contested, the performance at different stages in the education system about literacy and numeracy capability. I introduced those assessments to a lot of controversy. Lots of parties opposed me in the Scottish Parliament, but I thought it was necessary for us to have a better indication of the progress of young people through education before we got to the national qualifications in S4. So we've now got that data. What that data shows us is rising standards of literacy and numeracy as a consequence of those, what's shown by those assessments. So I would marshal that as evidence that you have to take into account in the mix. You've then also got a performance in national qualifications which, cannot possibly always go up. It just can't, because if it keeps on going up, commentators, perhaps even yourself, might say the system's getting dumbed down. So there's going to be fluctuation in performance, but we still have very high levels of performance.
PISA measures relativity, though, not...
Well, it does. But comparative performance year on year in national qualifications does exactly the same. It doesn't give you international qualifications, but it gives you year on year performance assessments within Scottish education. Picture that shows continuing strength within Scottish education. So, and I know folk kind of, every time I ever mention, what's the proper term is positive destinations in Scottish education, members of Parliament laugh. Well, frankly, that's what Scottish education's got to be about. What happens to young people when they leave school and go outside it? Do they go to good outcomes? Education, work, training, college, whatever. University, college, training or employment. And when we came into office, that number was sitting at something like about 86%, I think. The last number was 93. So young people are coming out of school, going into better outcomes as a consequence of the policies that we're putting forward. Now, members of Parliament laugh at these kind of things. I think it's ridiculous that they do that. But that's the measure of what matters. What are young people able to go on into the world to do?
John Swinney, thank you very much for your time. What's the rest of the evening got for you?
I'm going back to Parliament.
Thought you might be.
Because there's a vote at 9 o'clock. I actually, I had to really wangle a pass to get out to be here tonight. It was only when I said, look, it's Holyrood Sources. I can't possibly let them down. It's, sorry.
No, well,
sorry,
I would like
Calum and Andy, I had to say, it's Geoff. After all, it's Geoff.
That's
so
that's
what clinched it. I was allowed out for a limited amount of time, but I have got to... you see, we're running late.
I know. We're not as late as we
I've got to be back there
usually
for 9 o'clock.
What can you do? Miss the vote.
There's only so much you can do to control the length of politicians' answers.
Yeah, there's a fundamental difference between the First Minister missing a vote on the government's legislative programme and the Labour leader deciding not to bother turning up. I'm kind of,
First Minister...
I've got to lead from the front.
As I'm trying to do right now. First Minister John Swinney, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, John.
Great stuff.
Thank you very much. Thanks. All the best.